one of the things that I feel a little bit bad about is that we're moving through a lot of these books very quickly, like one sermon per book, and the book is like 30, 40 chapters long. But unfortunately, that's the way it is, and that's the only way we're going to go through this curriculum within 3 years. We're covering from Genesis to Revelation, and within 3 years, and we're seeing the grand narrative of God's salvation story, from creation to Abraham wandering in the desert and generation of Moses caught up in the land of Egypt, to Exodus, once again to the wilderness, and then entering into the promised land. And at this point of the story, they've lost the promised land, the land of milk, land that flows with milk and honey. And they are in Babylon, like the tension of like, guys, the punishment is coming, or justice is coming. You must turn your heart back to the Lord. Love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That, that call to repent has not been heeded very well, and now they're fully in Babylon. And Daniel's story is the first wave of exile. The land of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem is gone. The northern kingdom is gone. The southern kingdom is gone. Now the Jerusalem is gone. So everything is utterly gone and done with. And in this story, Daniel and his friends are physically living in Babylon. And I'm not quite sure about Daniel's 3 friends with kind of cool Babylonian names that I have a hard time saying. But Daniel, at least for Daniel, he never went back. Just like Ezekiel that I spoke to last Sunday, he never went back to his kingdom again, to the land of Israel, even though under the rule of King Cyrus, a Persian king who takes over Babylonians, he did permit them to go back, but I guess he missed that opportunity. And he never set his foot back on the land again. But as I share with you, the book of Daniel is starting off with Daniel and his friends, and they're exiled, and they're being they're walked into to Babylon. And there, Daniel and his friends enjoyed a long career in the royal court. Particularly, Daniel served multiple kings, and he sought favors of all the Babylonian kings until their fall. And I'm not quite sure if he actually made it to the court of Cyrus, but he was still alive then. I didn't get a chance to check that. But this is not unique, of course, because, for those of you who are familiar with Book of Nehemiah, he was also a Jewish man and who was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, and that position is position of honor and privilege, and he served king right next to him, and he enjoyed not only king's favor but also his deep trust as an advisor and a cupbearer to the king. So it's kind of cool and interesting that exile people, a refugee, would kind of make their way up in the echelons of society, not only just kind of being a good, well-to-do upper middle class, but they're actually in the courts, and God is using them to bring His glory and who He is in the upper echelon of society. So, but let's get into the nitty-gritties and how these things are panning out. So, you kind of wonder, what do you have to do then as a refugee and a conquered people to climb up the ladder so far and enjoy that kind of privilege? One, do I have to be assimilated, or did they have to assimilate themselves? And certainly we see a lot of assimilation that Daniel and his friends had to go through. But despite the assimilation, which I'll talk about in a minute, you also see that they're very distinct. And I can't talk about all the distinctiveness of their lives, but I will be focusing on chapter 3. But on Wednesday, I will focus on chapter 1, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that. So anyway, just like Daniel and his friends, we live in a society that discounts God and is largely secular. And this sermon is helpful, or this story and this message is helpful living in a world that prioritizes success and materialism and different political ideals that does not quite jive so well with Christianity in a lot of the parts. So Daniel and his friends are figuring out how to live in a land that is dominated by a culture that does not honor God. And their story, I'm hoping that will help us to see God in this, I don't want to say godless society, but at least in a secular society. Okay? So Daniel and his friends are being carried into Babylon. And there we see descriptions of their exile. And for Jewish readers, it's easy to pick up what is really happening in the text, but we're not ancient Jewish readers, so I'm going to explain some of the things to you. There are two things that you notice in chapter 1. That articles from the temple of God is being carried away. So all the holy and sacred things, the gold things, the things that are covered in gold, whether it's lampstand or dishes or plates, or utensils that were used inside a temple, they're all being carried into Babylon. And notice that these articles of holy sacred things from Yahweh, the only God who created all the things that are seen and unseen, and that's their faith, is being carried into the temple of Babylonians. It's being carried into Marduk's temple, and it will be used there for their worship. And just to say that your God, my God is stronger than your God, and my God beat your God. It's the kind of story of my dad can beat your dad. And in this case, my God did beat your God, and therefore anything that is found in your temple is now inferior to what is in ours. So it is right that it gets carried not into the royal treasury where they'll be melted and be sold for something else or used for something else, but now it will be used to serve our God. So there's a spiritual connection and transfer of deity and their superiority. So Israel's God is no longer superior in the eyes of Babylonians. And you'll see that the exile, the first wave at least, were predominantly, if not all, were royals and aristocrats, people who enjoyed the privileges of society, who were well educated, and a lot of them were worshipers of Yahweh. So they're being carried away, but just like the temple utensils and sacred items were carried into the temple of Marduk, the royalties and aristocrats, where do they belong? Because they've been subjugated by Babylon. Well, they go right into the palace of King Nebuchadnezzar, because our king beat your king. Our aristocrats and nobility and our horses and chariots have beat yours. So now you have to come to our palace. The royalties and aristocrats must come to our palace and serve us. And in the palace life, Babylonians were cruel people, but it seems like once you got into the palace, things were a little bit different. In the palace life, Daniel and his friends were subjected to good food, great education, and they were well taken care of. But they had to go through this assimilation process, right? I mean, we beat you, so you have to be like us. That's the sentiment. So they received Babylonian names, and they could no longer use their own name that has God and theology built into. So they had to change their name, and that was sort of, I'm sure that was a blow to their identity. And they had to no longer use Hebrew, but use Akkadian language, which is similar to Hebrew, I suppose, but it's a main language. It is the language of Babylonians, and they had to learn that. And also, they had to assimilate themselves by getting familiar with literature and philosophy and ideas of Babylonians. So they had to study for next 3 years, knowing reading the books that express the superiority of Babylon. And although it seems like in our story, Babylonians are coming in late in the story, but they've been brewing, and many people consider them as Sumerians, Akkadians and Sumerians as cradle of civilization. So they had rich culture, and they had a lot of ideas and philosophies, like Hammurabi Code, where the modern law derives its backbone and ideas. All of these things were developed by them, and they took great pride in that, and they were ramming that in for next 3 years into the life of Daniel and his friends. So they are in a dominant society that is telling them what they should be called, who they are, what they will learn, and how they should think and behave, and even what they shall eat. And how can your faith in Yahweh survive in that kind of environment when you are utterly and totally spiritually, religiously, and culturally defeated, and you're being subjugated by the dominant culture around you? I feel like in modern day, we don't get this kind of overt pressure. Well, actually, we kind of do, but in many ways, it can be subtle. The way we form our identity, our names, our preferences, and philosophy and ideas gets sort of permeated by the politics of the time, the political correctness, the politics of the left, politics of the right. And we find Christians on both sides of the fence, but their idea, their interpretation of how they should act and what they should believe in comes predominantly from the political ideas. So Tim Keller did this, and which I agree and I thought was interesting. He says, okay, on the political left, it says, I care about the poor, I care about the marginalized and people who are being oppressed, but don't tell me about sex and sexuality, because that's all entirely up to me, right? And the political right would say, well, my views and my ideas and values are conservative and maybe lines a little bit more with Christianity, but don't tell me about masks, don't tell me about how I should make money, or don't just talk to me about money, period. That's just my realm. And they kind of go with the political ideas, and their Christian faith gets targeted from a political and cultural perspective. Unfortunately, we had in the news, we've seen the shooting in Atlanta. And this is just a perfect example of how people are viewing this tragic event through the lens of politics in our culture. The people on the left side will say, look, there was a shooting and it's violence against women, it's violence against Asians. So they talk about gender and they talk about race. And the political right will say, look, don't make this about you. Don't make this about your political agenda, because it's about our political agenda. It's about a man who had a bad day. And he is obviously deranged. It's not about gender. It's not about race. It's about his sexual addiction. He has a problem, and he is buying into the sex culture. And in that addiction, he has committed these crimes. So either side of the fence is defending the violence and the crime, but they have a different reason why this man should be condemned and why this man has committed these atrocious crimes. My question to you is, how should we interpret this same event? And are we going to just, well, I lean more towards left, so I'm going to go with one idea, or I lean more towards right, so I'm going to go with another idea, and I'm going to find different response to the same event. What is Christian interpretation of this tragic event? Okay, not to say that they're both wrong, and that we need to find some alternative solution and reason. But we are affirming something on both sides, okay, and we're trying to see where the truth lies. But how should we interpret the pain and suffering and events of the world through the gospel message? And I'm not going to tell you this is how you need to look at it. There is a view that I have, but I'm going to largely leave that on your own to think about. But just be careful that you have strong biblical understanding and you have a biblical reason for looking at this event and interpreting your response and how you're going to be salt and light in the world. So anyway, as Daniel and his friends live in this culture that is forming their perspective and their religious views, political and philosophical views, and even what they should eat, they face a great challenge in chapter 3. For King Nebuchadnezzar, he comes and says, I made this wonderful golden statue. It's, and I'll use a modern measurement, it's 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. And it looks just like me because it's supposed to represent who I am. I am a wonderful king. I'm the best that there is. It's going to be made out of gold, and it's going to be tall, and it's going to be visible everywhere. And deifying a king, especially a king like Nebuchadnezzar, is important because that unites the vast empire. And if you have people support in the form of religion, it's really easy to control people, really easy to unite people, and ruling people becomes sort of a breeze, I suppose. And that's what he was looking for. He was looking to express the superiority not only of Babylon, but of himself, that he has done all of these things, and that they should bow down to him. So idea that's said here is we have great, big, amazing, awesome statue, and we're going to have every type of instrument on the planet, and we're going to invite anyone to come. And when the music plays, and it must have been such a cool tune, and there's a loud celebration, and that's a cue for all of you to bow down and face the statue and bow down and give worship. Well, to motivate people and incentivize this worship, King Nebuchadnezzar said, if you don't worship me, and if you don't bow down at the end of the song, then you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace, and you'll be burned alive. And the music played, and when the music ended, everyone bowed down to the golden statue, except there were 3 people at the back who was standing upright and saying, "Oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to bow down to you, for there is one God, and we only worship one God." And the dramatics here it should be noted, because we just read in chapter 1 that God's utensils and sacred objects are now being used to honor and worship and glorify and deify Marduk of Babylon. So why are you standing up for this God that does not do any good? God who has lost, and he is no longer protecting you. And this is a loser God. Why would you stand up for him? And obviously Nebuchadnezzar was upset. He got up, and to make the long story short, he throws these 3 guys into the fiery furnace. And this is what the 3 men says, well, God will deliver us even though you throw us into the furnace, for there is one God. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to bow down to you. And I want you to know that this is incredible transition in the faith of Israel. For until now, they believed in God who can deliver them from battle, who can deliver them from the grasp and the clutch of Egyptians. And they related to God who brought them victory and brought them manna in the desert, and who delivered them from skirmishes with remaining Canaanites and the superpower that was threatening their lives all the time. But here they are saying, I still worship God who doesn't deliver me, who will surrender me to the flames, because he is still God. For first time in their history, they're learning about God and honoring God who may not deliver them, who allows them to suffer for the time. And yet he is true God, and he is superior, because although his utensils are in the temple of Marduk, but not because he is powerless, but to bring restoration and purification and judgment upon us. So don't think for a moment that you won. And don't think for a moment that my suffering and my loss here is the ultimate end and loss, because there will come a redemption, and God will restore these things, and He will bring all of us back into the land where He has promised us. So this is a really interesting turn of events for me, that people are beginning to love God and worship God for His sake, not because God is God who makes them feel good, and God is God who will get them a job and get them a spouse in timely fashion. But beyond all that, they're experiencing God who is truly one God when everything is lost. And it's just incredible to see that their faith has come to a point in that time, although things are not looking good. And they're being faithful to God rather than just having a belief about God. So they're being obedient to Him, and there's something for us to meditate on there, right? And something for us to look, that even if you don't rescue me, I still believe in God, because God is God of all things, and He is present here with us. So in the furnace, but in that furnace, Nebuchadnezzar notices a fourth figure, and this fourth figure doesn't look like an average human being. And according to his words, it looks like a son of God, a divine being that is in there, untying and being present with these three men. And here, let's really meditate on this for a moment. In the text, only Nebuchadnezzar sees the fourth figure. All the satrap and governors and whoever else, his royals, wise men and magicians, none of them see the fourth figure. Only Nebuchadnezzar spots the fourth figure in the fire. And in that place, you know, that visage, the sighting of fourth figure is gift to Nebuchadnezzar, so that he would believe in God, who is superior and who is the only God. And here, we need to understand something about God, who is present with us in our suffering and in our trials. Notice that God appeared in the fiery furnace. That He's no longer, He is administrating His love for us in a different way. In the wilderness, He was a pillar of fire for everyone to see. But here, He's not like that. He is in the midst of the suffering, and He's in the midst of the fire, privately and personally, delivering these men in that place. And He only manifests Himself to one person, to the king of Babylon, and no one else. It seems to me what God is doing here is that He is revealing Himself to be a personal, intimate God who is present with us and who loves us. And He is He's seeking an intimate, personal relationship with His people and reminding His people that I'm here with you. I will not appear to you in the pillar of fire because I'm doing something different in your life. And I am true God, but to you, to those who are faithful, I will reveal myself. And God is God who is to be worshipped because He's personal God, who comes to rescue and who is present in the lives of the people. Now, I've heard sermons, and I really have heard sermons where brother preachers have said that if you're faithful to God, He will always rescue you. The entire Daniel is fighting against that notion. The entire book of Daniel is fighting against that notion, that God will surrender you at times to the flame, but He is there with you, is the message. And He may deliver you and He may not. But through your suffering and your trial, He will reveal Himself to others who have put you in that place. He will reveal himself to those who are in power, who are dominant, who are forcing their views, and who it seems like they have the laugh, but they don't. God will reveal himself to that place. And you know, this happened in the history of Roman Empire. When Christians were being thrown into Colosseum to be mauled by lions and bears and sliced and diced by gladiators because of their faith, and 300 years of that, King Constantine comes and dominates Rome, and he conquers it. And with his domination, he declares the country Christian. You see, all the sacrifices and trials of Christians went unanswered for 3 centuries, until one day, God worked in the lives of Constantine and others to say, I will reveal myself to your dominators. I will reveal myself to the culture that have been telling you that you're silly, you're dumb, your God is no God. Look at you, you're in Colosseum getting all sliced. You're a little puny God, and he's not going to answer you, and we're just going to watch you die. And God says, no, I'm present with you. I am doing something. I will redeem you, just like I have redeemed you and brought you back to the promised land. After all your suffering in Babylon, I will bring you back, and I will restore all of this in the land of Roman Empire. So we look to the future, guys. This isn't just a couple of things that happen in history and it's nifty and it's cool, but we look to the future. Although we are suffering here today, that we're waiting for God who will resurrect us, says resurrected. He will restore us into the final home. And we have this great hope, and we never lose hope in our oppression and all the things that we experience in the world, because God is present in the fire with us. That he reveals himself to us personally, and he is above the material. He is above the power and the culture that is dominating our times today. What is the alternative to having God who is present in our lives? The alternative is the golden statue, 90 by 9, 2:1 ratio. It's kind of interesting, although this is not a perfect example. On average, people are 7.5 to 1 in ratio to the rest of their body. If you're Asian, it's closer to 6, but don't worry, God loves you, and we're all good. And if you're a model, or if you want to be a model, then it's 2:1 ratio. And sometimes when fashion designers sketch, it can work to 9:1, 9:1 ratio, like head to the body ratio. But here we have 10:1. Oh, one more, sorry. And if you are making a heroic statue, the ratio is 9:1. But here we have a statue of Nebuchadnezzar that is 10:1 ratio. So we have this incredibly large, exaggerated, disproportionate body of figurine that is dominating the landscape. Only to say, look at me, I'm amazing. And I want you to like me. I want you to bow down to me. I want everyone to view what I am. Just in the same way that you and I, when we post something on our social media, Facebook or YouTube, we're just looking at how many people viewed, how many people commented, and how many people pressed like. And we kind of have that ideal of, I want to be liked, I want to be accepted. But really what we're looking for there, as in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, is that we're living this disproportionate life. That we are seeking more wealth, seeking more disproportionate amount of approval, disproportionate amount of wealth, and disproportionate amount of whatever it is that we're all seeing. And we're building this idol. It gets smaller and smaller. It starts small, but it gets bigger and bigger. But at the end of the day, we want to be 10:1. A disproportionate living, but visible, approved living. And if that is what you and I worship today, that we're worshiping disproportionate idols and disproportionate lifestyle, here's what is coming for us. That is it is awkward, that it is grotesque, but we don't know it and we don't understand it. When Babylonians took over most of the Mesopotamia and Greece, not long after that, about 70 years, Persians came and they destroyed Babylon. And not long after that, Greeks came and they destroyed Persians. And not long after that, Romans came and destroyed Greeks, and they dominated. Romans came. Yeah, I said Romans, right? Romans came and destroyed Greeks. And there was a long period of prosperity and peace, Pax Romana. But what does away with the sophistication and engineering and incredible culture of Greek and Rome, which we still, our modern society is based on, is barbarians. Barbarians come and they destroy the Roman Empire. If you and I are living and worshiping the 10-to-1 ratio of disproportionate living, what you and I have to do is we worship whatever Babylonian says. And then when Persians come, we worship whatever they say. And then when Greeks come, we worship them. And then it's so on and so forth. We just keep worshiping whatever is dominant, whatever is more powerful, whoever can do a greater disproportionate lifestyle of the time. And if they say, in order to have satisfaction of 2-1 ratio, the disproportionate life tomorrow is if you build 11-to-1 ratio of something. And each time, so what we are, the way that you and I would have to live is that our worship and our life is based on the pressures of life, the crisis of life. Whoever can dominate us more, whoever can tell us how to live our life, whoever has more power that day, we will just simply follow that. So we follow one social influence to another. Whoever has better Instagram followers, whatever is the political view and climate of the time, we just simply following those things rather than interpreting our culture, events, and pain and hardship through the gospel, through Jesus Christ. How can we live as Christians in this dominant secular culture, where the political left is telling us to live one way and interpret the world one way, and political right is saying same thing. They want us to interpret the world, but from their political point of view. We have to find ways to live in this culture, in this secular culture, that we're not gobbled up by whatever and whoever is telling us is the right way to live. Chuck Colson, who was a part of Watergate scandal, and he committed crime in the White House with Nixon. Later became a Christian in prison, and he once said this, the answer to the truth does not arrive on Air Force One. And what he's telling us is, yes, the truth, the true God doesn't necessarily come from Air Force One. And if I may extend that, the truth does not come from the pulpit either. Not in a sense where whatever the preacher is saying is how you must live your life. But what I'm saying is, if the preacher is saying the gospel, if he's telling you who God is and how to respond to God, and giving you room and space to do that, then you should go and study and meditate and learn and work together with other Christians to interpret how we should live our life here now and how we should interpret tragedy as Atlanta shooting. How does God see this event? How does God see the senseless, the violence and the death and the loss of life? What does God want us to do for these women and women like them? And how does God want us to subvert the sex addiction and the hate and that is motivated by gender and ethnicity? And how does God look at the man who committed all these violence? What is God's perspective of this man, and what would he do? And these are some of the questions that we must ask, rather than simply siding with one political view or whatever the society is telling us. We see in this story the form of Jesus Christ in the fiery furnace, that God is present, God is personal, and God is suffering with us in that place. You're saying, well, God is like Thor. He doesn't, he can go into fire. It doesn't bother him one bit. Well, maybe that is true. But we see that in form of Christ, that he went upon the cross, and he suffered with us. And in chapter 1 in Daniel, we see that God is humiliated in the same way that Christ is humiliated upon the cross, beaten, buck naked, bleeding, and being crucified next to two criminals. Utter humiliation, in the same way that the sacred articles of the temple is now being used in Marduk's temple. And you know what else? Later in the story of Daniel, not only do these sacred articles of God be used in the temple of Marduk, but they also get used in the sex party, or at least a drunk party of the kings of Babylon. And they use it there just to say, look, we are greater than your God. And God was utterly humiliated. And he is being humiliated, and he is suffering with us. He is present here with us. So that God for Daniel's friends became God who is above material, above culture, above power, and above Babylonians. So here we are today. Who is your God? Is he 10-to-1 disfigured, grotesque figures of our culture where we must bow down? And if somebody comes 11-to-1 ratio, and we're just going to go with that God? Or is your God who is here with you, who loves you, who moved into exile, and who is present with his people? I don't want to belabor this point. We got to go, right? 52. I just got one more illustration. In book of Ezekiel has this crazy, almost psychedelic vision. I share with you that Ezekiel's visions are just so strange and weird, and people don't know what to do with it. But here God is sitting on a throne, but has wheels that go this way and goes the other way. So it's a 4-axis wheel. And people don't know what that means, but what it means is that this is a wheel that can turn in every which direction. The wheel typically goes one way. So throne of God is no longer based in Jerusalem. It's no longer in the Holy of Holies. But God is sitting on a throne that is now mobile, that can go in any direction. So what is Ezekiel seeing that we need to be mindful of in the story of the book of Daniel is that God is now is no longer set in one place, but he has chosen to move with his people into exile. Just in the same way, the ark of God was in the wilderness and his presence was with his people. God is following his people into exile. And he will experience same humiliation and the same suffering to become personal God with his people, so that people can experience God not just as a law, but Emmanuel, who is present here with us. And that is the God that we believe in. And that's why we want to see the world through the lens of the gospel, through the lens of Jesus Christ. That is why he is superior and is above all things, and we're saying he takes precedence and priority in our lives. Political left, political right, and whatever rallies or president or a prime minister is not going to have our vote. That doesn't mean that we disagree with everyone, but we're saying we're going to step back and look at the world, look at our suffering from the lens of the gospel, where we'll not bow down to what the world is telling us to bow down to. We will not worship idols, that we will not worship disproportionate living that just says, worship me, follow me, think like me, do the things that I'm doing, and then follow the trends of our nation. Brothers and sisters, we need to know Jesus. We need to deeply meditate upon the suffering and humiliation of Christ as we go to Good Friday and Easter service. Don't just say, oh yeah, Jesus suffered for me, and I know and I believe that. But if God is present and is suffering and is being humiliated with us, will you also partake in that suffering and humiliation and say to the world, there are things that I don't agree with you. There are things about the money and sex, and there are things that I just don't agree with you. But I will love you. I will care for you. And you can come to our church anytime, regardless of your sexual orientation and your political bent, but we will accept you and we'll love you. We're not going to hate over you, but at the same time, there are non-negotiable things. And when you cross that line, we will not cross that line with you, but we will stay on one side, on the side of the light and the salt, and we will embrace you, and we will call for you, and we will wait for you, and we will invite you into that place, but we will not cross that line with you. And I think that's what this story is telling us today. And that's how Christians ought to be, that we read and we meditate and we think and we share that what we read and what we have meditated with one another.